Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joseph Houston, and as the director of the Lewiston Public Library, I would like to welcome you all to Great Falls Forum. The Forum is a monthly speaker series featuring leaders in the areas of business, public policy, academia, and the arts, and is a partnership of Bates College, the Sun Journal, and the Lewiston Public Library. Speaking of Bates College, hot off the presses here. As we head into MLK Day on Monday, Bates is going to have several events starting on Sunday night and on through all day Monday related to MLK celebration. So go to the Bates website to check on that slate if you are interested in attending or participating in any of those. Um, this year marks the 27th season of Great Falls Forum. We thank you for your support and ensuring the program's continued success. Today's program is also live streaming via Zoom, and a recording will be posted on the library's YouTube page. Please visit lplonline.org for more information. Please mark your calendars for our next Great Falls Forum on February 20th with Chief Justice Daniel Wathen. At the conclusion of today's program, there will be an opportunity for audience questions. Those in the room are welcome to raise their hands, and those joining us virtually can enter their questions using the Q&A feature on Zoom, and we'll read these to our speaker. And now I have the pleasure of introducing today's featured speaker, Maine Poet Laureate Julia Bouwsma. Julia Bouwsma lives off the grid in the mountains of western Maine, where she works as a poet, homesteader, editor, teacher, and small-town librarian. She's Maine's 6th Poet Laureate, currently serving a term from 2021 to 2026, and is the author of 3 poetry collections, the forthcoming Death Fluorescence, Midden and Work by Bloodlight. Honors include a 2024 Poet Laureate Fellowship from the Academy of American Poets and 2 Maine Literary Awards. Her work can be found in various publications, including Ecotone, Green Mountains Review, Kenyon Review, Plume, and Poetry Daily. Bouwsma has taught creative writing department at the University of Maine at Farmington, serves on the Community Advisory Board for Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, and works as the library director for the Webster Library in Kingfield, Maine. Please join me in welcoming Julia to Lewiston.
Thank you so much for that introduction. It's exciting to be here today. Yeah, pull out my words here. So I had started this by introducing myself, and I don't know that I need to now since I've been so beautifully introduced. I had to testify yesterday in Augusta for the Standing Joint Committee on Education and Cultural Affairs, which is always mildly terrifying. So I had this in my head, these kind of very formal remarks because I was still coming off of that. But I think that the bio you shared for me does show this. But I like to say that I wear a lot of different hats. Because I do think that it really influences the approach that I take to the role of poet laureate. So I am an author. I am a teacher, although not full time. I have worked in publishing. I was the managing editor for Alice James Books, and which is a terrific independent poetry press, nationally acclaimed. And I am still the freelance copy editor for them. I am the library director for Webster Library in Kingfield, Maine, as well, and have been doing that for 10 years. Um, and I'm also a homesteader. I live off grid in the mountains in New Portland, in our western mountains. And my husband and I raise pigs, chickens, vegetables, have a growing orchard, and produce maple syrup. And I say this because I really see my life as one that balances creative labor, educational labor, community labor, and the physical labor of living with the land. And I think each of these aspects of my work nurture and inform one another. So I've been writing poems since I was 8 years old. And if you had asked me at 8 what I wanted to do when I grew up, I would tell you that I either wanted to be a poet or a pirate. Um, Options. Um, I say this because I have now reached the middle of my life, and I realize that getting to do what you wanted to do when you were 8 years old is actually an incredible privilege and not that common, probably. So I've been reflecting on that, especially as many of the young people in my life are now 8-year-olds, and I wonder if any of them will be what they want to be then. Um, I stand here today in large part because when I was in third grade, a family friend who was a poet and a poet and a college professor, I grew up in New Haven, Connecticut, um, started volunteering to teach a poetry class at my school. And every week from third through sixth grade, she would pull a group of us out of class and take us to another room to write and talk about poetry. For each class, she would bring a poem for one student that she'd specially selected for us based on our work. I still remember that I had Hopkins, The Grandeur of God. And she'd give us a prompt, and we would write poems. And we practiced memorizing poems, saying them out loud, getting to feel the words in our mouths. I still have some of the poems that I wrote for that first poetry class. They're very embarrassing, but I can see in them the seeds of the poet that I would one day become. Because I've been writing poetry for most of my life, it is the lens through which I view and process the world around me. Poetry is, of course, where I first found my voice and sense of agency. But more importantly, I think it's where I first learned the true importance of listening. And so there's this quote by former U.S. poet laureate Joy Harjo, which has kind of been the quote of my term. Like I wrote it in my application to become poet laureate, and I am go around saying it everywhere. And that is, when I began to listen to poetry, it's when I began to listen to the stones, and I began to listen to what the clouds had to say, and I began to listen to others. And I think, most importantly for all of us, then you begin to learn to listen to the soul of yourself in here, which is also the soul of everyone else. Poetry is where I go to find and create a sense of connection with my beloveds, but also with strangers, connection with nature, with those who came before me and built the stone walls that stud the woods, the land I live and work on, um, the histories they carried generation through generation, my ancestors, the ancestors of this land, so that we might find the gift of this time here together this afternoon. And I want to say that one of my most deeply held beliefs is that the work of poetry is the work of living. I see poetry as essential for navigating life's struggles, joys, doubts, and even the tedium of our most mundane chores. I will say that chores are integral to my creative practice. If I am splitting firewood, if I am digging in my garden, um, there is something happening in my head. I'm not always conscious of it, but that communication between the head doing one thing and the hands doing something else, I feel like there's a call and response in that. I feel like there are cadences that become absorbed into the poems. Um, I feel like so much of poetry is about call and response, poems talking to each other, us learning to talk to each other through poems. Um, Poetry opens us to possibility by allowing us to question, to see things in unexpected ways, to feel intensely, to tell our stories, to listen and connect with the people and world around us. Considered this way, poetry is really about the work of being human. And the more we engage with it, the more equipped we become to support one another. I believe that poetry, particularly in times of crisis, polarization, isolation, and uncertainty, is one of our most powerful tools. Because as poet, activist, and librarian Audre Lorde once wrote, it is our dreams that point the way toward freedom. I want to think about dreams for a second because the architecture of poems and dreams is, in my mind, very similarly compressed. Something can become something else very quickly in a poem and in a dream, right? Or be more than one thing at the same time. Poetry engages not just a word's meaning, but also its sound, the way it looks on the page, the way it feels in our mouths, the memories it stirs up. In this way, a word or line can have multiple meanings, come alive in multiple dimensions. Once, many years ago, I dreamt I had a female mastiff, and she gave birth to a litter of puppies. And in my dream, this meant that my first manuscript of poems was finally going to be published. Um, and so I woke up and I realized that this made no sense, right? And the strange dream logic faded. But my sense of renewed hope and wonder remained. Um, Poetry sets our joys side by side against our sorrows. And in doing so, it creates a kind of friction that leads to the sparks that electrify the space between the reader and writer, that light the darkness so we might find one another. And in this way, poetry can transcend time and distance. In this way, possibility is born. As poet laureate, it is my job to help extend the reach of poetry and the sense of possibility it provides across Maine in as many ways as possible. This is the boring part of the talk. Um, the practical reality of this is that a lot of my work is done in my car. I have now visited and participated in poetry-related events in 14 of Maine's 16 counties. I am committed to visiting all 16 by the time my term is done in 2026, and I have plans. I'll be traveling up to Aroostook in May. In the past year, I have spoken. We want to hear this list. We don't want to hear this list. I did that. I thought this was a good idea yesterday because I had to give this list to the legislature, but it's a lot of towns and some of them more than once. And I also had the honor of representing Maine at the 2024 Association of Rural and Small Libraries Conference in Springfield, Mass., where I got to talk about poetry programming in tiny libraries. And the 2024 National Book Festival in Washington, D.C. And everywhere I go, I have the chance to speak to people about poetry, which is one of the great aspects of my job. So sometimes that conversation is amazing, right? Some people value poetry deeply. They tell me about this time that they wrote a poem or they read a poem at the darkest time in their life, and they think it saved them, right? And probably more often they tell me that they feel a bit intimidated by poetry or a bit put off by poetry, or they love the idea of poetry, but they are not going to be reading any poetry. And so that's a thing, right? I think in many ways my job is to be waging a PR campaign for poetry. Why do we need it? Why does it matter? Which is why I started the talk with that. Many of us still need some convincing, I think. And I think part of that comes from the fact that when we are taught poetry in school, many of us were taught poetry in school in a way where there was a secret code, right? We focused on the poem's meaning and there was a secret code, and maybe one or two students would get it right, but everybody else felt like they didn't even want to speak. I see nods, yes. Um, I love to visit schools and talk to students and teachers because I'm hoping that we can move away from this way of interacting with poetry. Um, like I said earlier, poems mean different things, right? To the point where we want words to have multiple meanings in the poem. And then one of the great beauties of poetry is that I can write a poem about baseball. I mean, I won't because I know nothing about baseball. But if I did, right, and I wrote this poem about baseball, and maybe you read this poem about baseball, and I don't know you, but you pick up this poem and you read it, and it turns out that your father, who just passed away, used to take you to baseball games, right? And now you're crying because of this poem, right? So it's so much more meaningful than the poem I originally wrote. So when I say that the poem really takes place in that space between the reader and writer, I mean what you bring to it as a reader matters as much more, maybe, for certainly for you, than whatever I thought of when I was writing. So it doesn't really matter what I was thinking of, right? No poet ever wrote a poem being like, I hope they get this illusion that I'm dropping in here. We just did that to make the poem richer, but it doesn't, there'll be something you'll pick up on that I won't know I did. And so that's what's exciting, right? To explore how much further the poem can go beyond what we initially anticipated. Um, so when I talk to students and teachers about poems, one thing that I like to stress is the poem is first and foremost an emotional experience. Um, so how does the poem make you feel? And then what is the poem doing with language that helps you feel the way you feel? Right. And so that's the way I like to frame it. And then there are all the tools, and we can use the whole toolbox to figure it out, but they are all in service to the idea of the emotion rather than the meaning, right? Because we can feel things mean more than one thing, we feel more than one thing. And that complexity, that refusal to compartmentalize and tease out, but to have that density there, I think that's really what a poem is about in many ways. So I went totally off the script of my notes there, but um, I'll bring myself back to this to say, oh, yeah, to tell you about things that I've been doing. Let's see. So some of the things that I do as Poet Laureate, I am one of multiple hosts for the Poems from Here program on Maine Public. We feature poems by poets from all walks of life all over Maine. Um, it's me, and then also Gibson Faye LeBlanc, Samat Abdurraqib, Niku Paul, and Arisa White as hosts. It was important to me that we have multiple voices, but this program started with my predecessor, Stuart Kestenbaum, and it's a wonderful program. And I think it gives this opportunity through poetry to listen to one another. There are so many secret poets around here. There's a woman in my town who's a soil engineer, but it turns out she writes poems about soil and publishes them in engineering magazines. And so I found out and read one of her poems in the Poem from Here program. And then, with her permission, I played it um, in our town at our library's annual poetry celebration because I thought that people should know that there's people they don't, your neighbor is writing poetry and you don't know it, right? One time, I met someone and I introduced myself and she said, "What do you do?" And I was still learning, getting used to the idea of saying that I was a poet. I said, "I'm a poet." And she said, "Wow, I've never met anybody who actually admitted that before." So I think about that often, then it matters to it. If you're secretly writing poetry, you can own that. You don't have to pass a secret hurdle before you say that you're a poet. Um, Poetry Out Loud is another program. that I participate with and I love. I was actually just in Augusta this morning at the Maine Arts Academy, helping to judge their first ever Poetry Out Loud competition. So, Poetry Out Loud is an national NEA and MAC sponsored contest. So, it's a recitation contest for high school students, and they have to memorize poems and then recite them. And I mean, it's the poems these kids memorize are very long and very complicated, and it's incredibly impressive to see them do that. So it helps build them up as public speakers. It helps them understand that you can really embody a poem. You can let that enter you and fill you and become the vessel to deliver that poem. And it's beautiful when you can really see that connection to the poem coming out in the way that the students express the poem. So I love being a part of that. I've played many different roles in the last few years, but I always like to be involved in one way or another. Um, I also want to tell you about a project that is very dear to my heart and that I'm really excited about right now, which is the Write Me, Write Maine Epistolary Poetry Project. This is the project that I'm doing for the fellowship for this poet laureate fellowship from the Academy of American Poets, which provides funding to poet laureates, but it's based on a project proposal. And so they give you some funding to pull off the project and then some to support you as poet laureate. And so my project is epistolary poetry. An epistolary poem is a poem that is also a letter. Um, I've been really interested in this form for a long time. You will see that when I start to read some of my poems in a minute or two. You'll see that start to show up. But the intimacy, right, of a direct address in a poem, the ritual of letter writing, the urgency of it appealed to me really deeply. And as a form in terms of thinking about community, the accessibility of the form mattered to me. Everyone has written a letter, right? So, of some sort, if only an email or a text, right? We have all had that direct communication with someone else. So, if you are poetry curious but poetry intimidated, it's an amazing form to start with. Um, so, what this project did, there was a small pilot version in 2023 founded by the Maine Arts Commission. And then with this fellowship, I was able to take what I had learned during the pilot and have a larger version. So we had 22 free public workshops on epistolary poetry, each taught by a different Maine poet. So in that way, I could also support the other many talented poets in this state. And these were all to help introduce people to the form, get comfortable writing it. Each poet put their own spin on it. So we had all of these different versions. We had one celebrating love letters. We had one specifically using art and collage. Richard Blanco taught a virtual one. We had one specifically for youth, led by Maya Williams, who's a former Portland Poet Laureate, and Yashu Darasala, who is the Portland's inaugural Youth Poet Laureate. So that was really exciting piece of it. After that, we invited people to sign up for a poetry pen pal. And so we now have over 230 people corresponding through epistolary poetry with one another, and they'll be doing that through March. And then in May, we'll be planning a hybrid celebration of that at the end of May to take place at the Waldo Theater. I'm hoping that'll be an intergenerational celebration and multimedia as well. So that's really just a really important project to me because it gives people the opportunity to communicate with someone that they might otherwise not know or meet. This is a large state, and as someone who lives, you know, in a rural part of it, we have too much isolation. We have too much polarization. And so I wanted people who might otherwise not have a chance to be in touch with each other to engage poetry, which is an inherently a vulnerable form um, to communicate with each other. So I'm really excited about that. I'll tell you one other thing that I'm doing, and then I'll read you some poems. Let me see. Yeah. So in the name of collaboration and partnership, and trying new things that are scary, I am also doing that myself in my own creative work. So recently I was asked to write a libretto for a 30-minute chamber opera, which was in collaboration with composer Nathan Davis and the Halcyon Quartet. Um, the opera is called Ghost Apples. It is inspired by Virgil's Georgics and reflects on Maine's agrarian histories and narratives to reimagine a collective future in the face of climate change. It's going to combine song with Halcyon's music and projected film. And it will be there'll be performances taking place in the fall of 2025 or late summer, with more information coming soon about that. So let me read you a few poems. One thing that I think about often is this quote by Edna St. Vincent Millay, who was one of my favorite Maine poets and whose grandmother is actually buried in a small cemetery on my land in New Portland. Um, and one of the things I think about is this letter she wrote once to her mother, where she basically said that publishing a book of poetry is the same as appearing in public with your trousers down. I'm really interested in the idea of poetry as a radical vulnerability. So, with that in mind, sometimes I like to voluntarily embarrass myself when I give talks. And I'm going to do that today by reading to you one of the poems that I wrote in that elementary school class. This is called Dragon Lore. I ran so fast to escape the yellow, slimy dragon that I did not know whether I was swimming, flying, or running. The world faded, and the whirling mist arose around my head. I was startled by a mighty clap of thunder, and then the sky began to weep. I saw the yellow blur of the dragon die, but I kept running on and on for eternity. The first really hard act of revision that I had to learn as a young poet was not to end all of my poems with the word eternity. It was really tough. Like, I had to be convinced that that was a good idea, which is funny, right? But so I don't write like that now, but I will say that the intensity of that early poem is kind of still there. So I'll read you a couple poems from my first book. I'll read you one or two from my second, and I'll read you a couple new poems. And I'll keep a good eye on the clock. Speaking of intensity, this is a poem that is affectionately known as the Weasel poem. But this is a poem about the time that, actually, you know what? I don't think I want to read that poem. I changed my mind. I'm going to read from my first book a poem called Haying, even though it is seasonally inappropriate. But how nice, right, to be too hot. Haying. There is no poetry in this work. Sweat flows spine like a river, drowns black flies in my waistband, and chaff splinters fissures skin, arms, and chest until my whole body is a burning barn. Words thicken a blanket of storm clouds, a silence that hangs above our running limbs until it smothers thought. The bales lie in the field waiting. The sky opens its mouth to let its darkness out, and we know this moment only as now, a counting off. One bale passed between six sets of hands, one bale pressed into place beneath the eaves, one truckload and another, our bodies which cannot stop moving, even as rain begins to beat its fists upon the barn roof, even as the thunder clouds sound the pocket knife thrown to the pile of sheet metal, even as bales spoil in the field, until our bodies lose the language for pain, until there is no before us and no after us. The cat's eyes perch in the blackened barn, two kerosene flares waiting. Only one more bale the cat needs to reach the swallow's nest. I mean, there's a little bit of a dark streak that runs through the poems. Even in that one, you think it's not going to be there. Okay, so I'll read you one other. This book has a lot of farm poems in it. This is a lot of me discovering the less pastoral aspects of the pastoral. Land and body. And I should say that in my mind, anyway, this is a love poem. Land and body. Here, we have survived another year. Take this bounty, our love, the resistance we feel between our teeth as seeds crack and extend their pale finger selves into paper towel, then earth. Buried alive so they may grow into green billowing, we will eat as a new promise. Saute in garlic, olive oil, feed to one another, as if to say, there is no distance between taking and giving. A ritual of regret carried out beside the deer head on the porch, its skin flaked to sodden leather dark as leaf mulch. And my hands have traced the pale trifold stitching of skull. And I have been in mud today. I have cleaned up shit, clotted through boxes of frozen chicken, leg after leg split and stacked like cordwood into the box, splintered bone, flesh skinned pink, a cold meat. And your hands have set the cinder blocks for a woodshed, have split the kindling, have dug the grave for the dog who lies rotting against ledge rock 4 feet down in a frost heave, waiting until the irises spread up over his brindled, poisoned bloom, his cancer-chewed paw, his canine shining white as the moon that slips naked to run against our snow-spread lawn as we stand in front of the door, your arms folding me into you until I feel it, our hardness, the bicep and bruise of all the sap buckets we have lifted and poured, every bag of grain hauled, bale of hay thrown, animals we have mended and killed, tasted, tricked to the slaughter, every potato forked from the ground, each nail pounded, the boards above and below us, how all of it binds us, grafts us, one into the other, our freshly harrowed skin. So that's enough of the first book. I'll read you something from the second book. My second book, Midden, is a book of poems about the Malaga Island eviction. So, always, briefly, but just in case, because this is a story, a piece of our history that was not talked about for so long. I will reiterate it just in case there's anyone who doesn't know, that in 1912, the state of Maine forcibly evicted and erased an interracial community of about 45 people from Malaga Island off the coast of Phippsburg. There were 9 people, including the entire Marks family, who were sent by the state to the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded, what is now Pineland Farms. Um, there was a school on the island that was taken down and reassembled on another island. The other people were basically told that if they didn't take their houses down, they would be burned. They took their own homes apart because they needed the materials to rebuild. And there was a cemetery on the island, 18 graves consolidated into 5 caskets and reburied unmarked at the Maine School for the Feeble-Minded. And so all of that took place within 1 year. And then there was about a century of silence that followed it. And it was really only in the early 2000s that this began to be discussed. And there were archaeological digs that were led by the University of Southern Maine that really began that discussion. But in any event, I found out about this in 2006 or 7 myself, and I was deeply haunted by this history and kept doing research, and research led to a whole book of poems about it. And I should say at the same time, I was working on my first 2 books kind of back and forth. So the first draft of my first book was written in 2007. But then it wasn't published in 2000 until 2017. And so I was going back and forth, revising one manuscript and working on the other, and moving back and forth between the 2 books. And I should say too that I was the land I live on. I moved there in 2008. So these homesteading poems, this sense of the land as this vital piece of my own identity and my relationship to it was informing the work that I was writing about Malaga very heavily. This poem is called Interview with the Dead, and it's in sections, so bear with me. Who were you then? And instantly the tongue becomes the prism of fracture, land of washed green light, ferns, wild hops, hemlock, lichen skinning the granite outcrops. And instantly the tongue becomes a well, a stone cast into memories falling. When there's no one left to name the helix of departure unfurling inside you, wear silence as a tattered shirt, a stain of torn buttons. We carried it in our spines, and anyone could see it when we walked. And instantly the tongue turns to salt, white film, and blanch, for not even the tongue can taste what came before salt. How do you remember your island? As stone fingers spread an octave into the sea, as salt brands ankles and red mud heels callous to clay, as dreams in which we still pick blackberries, as brambles scratch a map into our skin, as we thread the fish hook, pull the line taut, as a catch of blood in the back of the throat, as fingers tying a knot. How did you leave? Our houses became our bodies. We lashed ourselves to rafts. Our bodies became boats. Some left as cargo in boats' boxes. We wept or did not weep until home became the rubble between our teeth, the thing one cannot bite for fear of breaking. Then we were a people sculpted of wind, and when we left, we scattered as breath, lingered as breath. Then we were a people carved of gravel and dust, and we left as the land stripped from the land, carrying our hearts in our fists. Where did you go? To hallways of sweat and bleach, to white walls and locked doors, to brass bed frames and the endless folding of sheets, to the thin lips of strangers at the market, to back doors of summer mansions, to mud flats and shanty camps, to clusters of islands too tiny to name, to houses rebuilt with the same old boards but smaller this time, and the windows all in the wrong place. What did you leave behind? Our arms spread out around it all until our hands could not meet our hands. Okay. Do we have we have time for a couple new poems still before questions? All right, let's see. I have three I was thinking of. That might be too long, but one of them's a little long. Is that okay? All right. Not as long as that, but this is a poem that in many ways I think comes out of a lot of what I was thinking about when I wrote Midden. It's called After We Wound the Land to Maps. Better stewardship than ownership, but this wooded hill has never needed anyone. Without us, it stretched its green flanks feral, the blackberry canes cracked under their own weight. Deer tramped switchback tunnels through the undergrowth. Columbine erupted purple and pink white beneath sugar maples. Without us, the hill's scars turned porous. August aster bottle brushed from cellar holes. A stand of ash rose from a single stump. Snakes studded themselves into the splicing silences of the stone walls and slept. Without us, the stories grew moss and sprouted saplings like an erratic boulder from its hulking granite back. And likely the hill preferred this, for it never needed us here to hear or tell of the seven-sided pole barn filled with its 7 years of trash, of the baby diapers and propane tanks that shot shrapnel when the man before us set it ablaze. Nor did it need the story of the DEA helicopter sent to arrest the man before him, man of shotgun and wild rumors of holes all over the front lawn where the pot plants grew and where we still now sometimes stumble carrying our buckets. No, the land didn't need the herd of cows before him either, or the family they belonged to, the ones who built this rotting cabin, who dug septic and well and then one day just up and disappeared. Though that woman came back once in a dusty white minivan driven by her daughter, came to see one last time her lost home and told me through plastic oxygen tubes from the car window of a time when this whole hillside rolled with wheat, sheep, fields, and the hubris of a farmer who scrambled to gather his hay as thunderclouds bore down upon him, how once the last bale was in, he shook his fist at the sky in triumph, and the sky replied a pitchfork of lightning straight into the roof of his barn. So fire, so all those fields regrew to woods, so new scrub for the partridge, so no trace of the now vanished schoolhouse, nothing left of the sawmill but a clogged stone dam and a swamp of dank leaves. Just the headstones remain, mildew and algae on marble, children buried before their parents. Just the rusted gate, the tree bent chain link, the last rest left home at first opportunity, drawn by the heady violence of opportunity, abandoned this hill to a new violence of boundary pins and parceling out. And now I am here, an unwanted steward, unneeded witness. I am here, and this topography has made a debt of me. The debt began before we ever arrived. Perhaps the debt began when someone followed a deer through the woods on the way to the river, or perhaps when the mountains first churned with glacial debris. Certainly the debt began when someone wrote their name on a property map, a deed, and by the time we arrived adolescent on the solipsistic romance of our own manifest destiny, believing we could make our own end, glowing from the flickering light of flame-colored leaves, we already knew. The wound was us. It lodged in our throats. It grew under our tongues, moss to a slope, lily of the valley to a grave, until we could no longer discern the green of the hill from the skin of our hands. Each spring weeps its spring runoff, sugars the trees with tears, but the wound remains. The wound festers violet and lilac. It swells a bloat pond of summer warbling. It lacerates a hot fist of fall color with the urgency of an extinction burst. And yet the land lumbers on, its low dirge of survival and pine pitch stitching us, lichen to lesion, light to ligament, rock to rib. I always forget how much work it is to read that poem. The hard part is that there's no stanza breaks, and now that I have these middle-aged eyes, I lose track of where I was, even with the progressives. Um, I am not going to read more poems because I want to make sure. You know what? I'm going to read one more, but not two more. Um, I did say something about epistolary poems and then I didn't do any. So I'm going to end with this poem here, which is a poem that I wrote as the first public poem that I was asked to write as Poet Laureate. And this is a poem that was placed in the state time capsule to celebrate our bicentennial. So I guess this will be opened in 2120. To a Mainer living 100 years from now. The other day I stood beneath an ash tree as old as the time between my writing this letter and you reading it. Inside the green moment of the forest, I traced my finger across the ash's trunk. Grooved bark staggered like vertebrae. A deer bent back to listen. Quiet flanks reddening the stillness before crouch became bolt, and it leapt into a lattice of blackberry cane and brush. Tell me, unknown friend, what has dissipated from our home and what remains? Does it still snow hard enough to swallow your footsteps in light? Do you drink sap each spring, boil your sorrow into new waft and gold? We lived here at the edge of the old rituals, lived there until we could not discern our hope from our fear. Wildfire smoke smeared a low brow of bruise, a language written in billowing keloids and contrails, vanishing welts of vapor. Are you still repeating our same old violences, or have you learned new ones? Can you wring a chicken's neck with your hands, twist and pull the throat in unison, as my grandmother's grandmother did, and I do now? Or have you colonized Mars, erected skyscrapers of cosmic concrete? Scientists are at it now, discovering a building material of human tears, sweat, urine, blood. It hardens fast and cheap, stronger, they say, than anything you've ever known before. For you, I wish nothing but bird song. I wish you a pond of peepers screaming spring thaw. and all those apple trees I planted. It's early autumn now, their striated skins seeping blush into white flesh as they ripen. Do they still stand on this hill? Pick one for me, please, if they do. Bite down among stippled wormholes and taste our blinding sweetness. So I should say that poem is actually sort of the premise for the opera libretto, expanded and in multiple voices. Um, okay, I guess we have time for a few questions. Oh, I guess you can applaud. I don't remember about that kind of thing.
Hello. I was very impressed with your background and what you've done. I'm just wondering, were you appointed, selected?
Yeah,
This,
that's a good question. Yeah, so there was a basically there was a call for poets who thought they might want to be poet laureate to apply, and I did not consider applying at all because I thought I was too young. And then someone in my community asked me if I would please apply. Um, and so I gave in and I sent in an application, and there was a committee that reviewed the applications and made those decisions.
who selects?
So I was selected by a committee.
Okay.
Yeah. A
Thank you.
committee of people. It was created through the Maine Arts Commission assembled the committee. There was someone from MWPA on it. There was someone from the Maine Humanities Council on it. I'm honestly not sure everyone that was on it. No. Yeah, so that must have been. I'm told that I'm the sixth, which means from when they started counting, Kate Barnes was the first. And so that I think would precede that. I mean, Maine has a huge history of poets, so. All right.
I have a question from Zoom from Maureen, who says, thank you so much. When reaching out to K through 12 classes, how do you gain buy-in from teachers who are time strapped and pressured by testing?
Yeah, I think that's a huge thing that I don't know how to solve exactly. um, I will say that generally at this point, because of my capacity, I'm generally, it's usually that schools approach me and then I figure out how to get there and do that. In terms of so it's not so much that I'm reaching out to educators because I just don't have that personal capacity to do that. But with things like Poetry Out Loud, we do, and there's certainly an outreach effort there. This epistolary poetry has components where I have poet Don Potter prepared lesson plans. So if there are any teachers, we're going to look on trying to get those out to schools all over Maine. But I think in terms of how to get buy-in, I mean, all I know is to say that I was a kid who had big things going on at home. And for me to have the power and agency that I found on the page to make another world for myself there was the most powerful thing I can think of. So I know that there's so much pressure for testing, for all of these things, but I also know that teachers want to meet their students as individuals, and that what they really want to do is help them, you know, get to a point where they can have the life they wanted. So all I can tell you is that poetry is a way to do that. It's a way to motivate students to learn language and to enjoy language. When I did my graduate degree, I actually did my student teaching portion of my Master's of Creative Writing in a first grade classroom. And I will tell you that the kids who had poetry instruction at the first grade level they were carrying notebooks out to recess. I mean, and their regular classroom teacher said they were definitely more motivated and ahead of the game in terms of reading and writing because they felt that sense of agency. So, especially in in a system that is stripping agency from our students, and teachers, all the more reason to find a way, I think.
Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed your poems and also what you said about poetry. You mentioned the Poetry Out Loud program,
Yeah.
and we've had that in this community, and it's been wonderful. And I wonder if you would say more about the importance of memorizing poems, because it seems to me that that's something that those young people who participate in the program do. But in the schools generally, I don't think there's very much memorizing of poetry. And could you say something about what you think the virtue of that is?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think you're probably right. There isn't so much of that anymore. The Academy of American Poets has a program that they do in April, which is Poetry Month, called Poem in Your Pocket Day. And the idea is that you find a poem you love, you print it out, and you put it in your pocket. And all day long, you come up with different ways to share it with people. If you memorize a poem, you have a poem in your pocket every day, right? You have a poem inside you that you carry in your body when you're not wearing clothes with any pockets at all, right? So it's always there with you. I think about this when my grandmother, um, who died at the age of almost 93, in the final, near the end of her life, my uncle was recording her. And she was we affectionately called it downloading in our family. It was like, she's reliving all of these memories, all of these things. And she would sing little songs that she had learned in school. And she would recite poems that she'd learned in school. And they were all just in her, and to the point where my uncle recorded her, and at her funeral, we listened to her reciting Carlyle, here hath been dawning another blue day. Think wilt thou let it slip useless away. So I have that poem, in my head, my grandmother's voice, where you could already hear the fluid in her lungs from that, right? And it means so much to me. And she, the rabbi said it was the first, right, that he'd ever heard someone speak at their own funeral. But that's what you could do if you've memorized a poem. You could speak at your own funeral. There's all kinds of things. So I think it's, to have that poem inside us, to let us, it enter us in that way where we can keep it forever. It's really cool. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody. That is everything that we have time for. Thanks for joining us. Another round of applause for our guest here.
Thank you so much.